Hi, this is Julie Cooper, a mystery and thriller writer, and half of the duo bringing you Kendall and Cooper Talk Mysteries. We'll get started in just a moment, and I know Wendy's anxious to introduce our mystery guest. But first, I want to give thanks to my brother Chris Squires for being the composer and performer for our theme music, entitled The Man in the Panama Hat. Over to you, Wendy.
Wendy Kendall here, mystery lover and cozy mystery writer. Julie, the true test of a book moving from my good category to my great category is how well it transports me out of my everyday life, especially on my weekday bus commute, which is round trip almost 2 hours and where I do a lot of my reading. Today's guest, among his works that I've been reading, his DeMarco series has truly crossed over from good to great. In his novel, House Odds, I was sitting on the bus with my briefcase on the seat next to me. I was so fully engaged in the character, Joe DeMarco's inner thoughts and analysis, intermixed with mobsters' crimes and strategies, and then discovering Congressman Mahoney's desperate dealings, I had absolutely no sense of the bus around me. After 40 minutes and several stops, the bus had filled up, and the lady wanting the seat next to me was practically shaking me by the shoulders to get my attention. I moved my briefcase, and when she sat down, I asked her, "Wow, have you read this book yet?" Our guest today is author Mike Lawson. He's the award-winning author of 14 published novels. He's been nominated for the Barry Award 6 times and has twice won the Portland-based Friends of Mystery Award for his Joe DeMarco political thriller series. The first book in his second series, titled Rosarito Beach, involving a rogue DEA agent named Kay Hamilton, was optioned for television. Mike's 11th DeMarco book, House Revenge, was released in July of 2016, just last year, and his third Kay Hamilton book, K Street, is released now in January. Prior to turning to writing full-time, Mike was a nuclear engineer employed by the Navy, and he lives in the Northwest. I encourage all of our listeners to check his website, MikeLawsonBooks.com. I am so excited to welcome you to Talk Mysteries, Mike Lawson.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I appreciate that. I can't imagine a 2-hour commute, though. Well.
Yeah, well, your books have helped make it much easier. I really enjoyed them. You know, Mike, you've mentioned that you love Washington, D.C. because it's target-rich environment for a writer, inspiring fiction, whether it's something about corruption, if it's outrageous, if it's heroic or dangerous. How thin is that line between fiction and fact?
Well, I think it's pretty thin. I mean, in a lot of the books, and I've mentioned several times, I'll give a case of a congressman or a senator that's been indicted for tax evasion, wire fraud, racketeering, etc. And I mentioned in the book, when you read the indictment, you'd think it was a mafia gangster instead of a legislator. And those are actual instances that actually came out of the news. I mean, I didn't mention, most of the time that the person by name. It's surprising how often, you look at the paper and you'll see a corruption case of some kind or something mysterious going on. And most of my books are based on something, not all of them, most of them are based on, something in real life that happened. And quite often it's something that's, that sprang out of a Washington Post article or something you've seen on the news and that's Washington related. So like I said, Washington is just, I wanted to set, the DeMarco series there just because there is so many things going on that you can always draw on for the next book. And it's amazing just how many of them are actually based on, real life. Same way with the second Kay Hamilton book. It was based on something that was real life.
I think your your Viking Bay book has also got elements of real life, doesn't it?
Well, that's what I was talking about. When I wrote that book, I mean, the plot basically involves the lithium reserves there in Afghanistan. And I'd read about that. They did a geological survey about how they have these enormous lithium reserves in Afghanistan. And so in the book, I've got what I thought was a fictional plot talking about bribing a Afghan governor with, and I plucked a number out of the air. I plucked $50 million. We're going to bribe him to get to the lithium rights. Well, it turns out that in 2010, I think, and I didn't really realize this until I was halfway through the book, New York Times reporter James Risen had written a story about the Chinese actually attempting to bribe the Afghan Minister of Mines with $30 million for copper rights. So it's, I thought I was just making it up, but I wasn't.
That's amazing.
It's great.
As a reader, I love reading about characters that are put in situations that could really happen. So that's the real tangible appeal of the series for me. Now that information is exchanged freely on social media, is that also one of your sources for inspiration, or how do you like to use social media with your writing?
Well, I have to admit, I don't use it very much. I probably should do a better job at that, but I spend very little time on Facebook and Twitter, and usually I only do it when a new book is coming out just to let folks know about it. I just not very much into that, to tell you the truth. And most of my stories will come out of, like I said, newspaper reports or things I see on the news or books I read or something like that. So social media for me has mostly been a way to promote the books, but I'm not very religious about getting on there every day and telling folks what I had for breakfast.
And that doesn't make the most interesting readings, actually. So I can see your point. How much of a detective are you as an author in order to uncover the intricate plotting and motivations that are surrounding the mysteries that you write? I mean, do you mentally see yourself committing the crime in order to write the plot?
Well, I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, that's sort of what you do. I've always kind of described the books in a little way like a little engineering problem. Like you come up with a scenario, and to give you an example, the third DeMarco book had to do with the no-fly zone around D.C. I'd read an article about it in the Post, and so I had the idea for the book that, what if somebody was to fly a little Cessna toward the White House, and when that happens, they sound the alarms, and the F-16s come out of Andrews, and they blow the little plane out of the sky. So that was chapter 1. I had no idea what chapter 2 was going to be.
But that's a good place to start. Yeah.
And so then you start going through a process of, well, what would be the motivation for a little Cessna, attacking the White House? And you can pick A, B, C, D, or E. And so I picked C, and I start writing that way. And then I say, well, how would the good guy react to that? And again, you got 3 or 4 options. You pick one of them, you start writing that way. And so I end up doing a lot of rewriting and going back and forth. But I guess the book's a little problem-solving exercise in a way, in terms of taking the basic plot, the characters' motivations, the reaction of the protagonist versus the antagonist, and that's how you end up coming up with a story. Is that the conflict between them and what's happening. And from chapter to chapter, I'm never really quite sure where I'm going until I get to the end, and then I start rewriting the book all over again.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, I like Joe DeMarco's temperament very much. I feel like he's a pragmatist and a realist. He hasn't reached cynical or jaded, but he's definitely not a starry-eyed optimist at the other end of the spectrum. He doesn't turn a blind eye to dirty dealings and the shady side of human nature, even with his congressman boss. And what I really like about him is he's not a Superman. I like that he's sort of an average Joe that's put in extraordinary circumstances. What's been your process creating this character? And as a writer, what advantages and disadvantages are there to this guy's personality?
Well, I guess there's a couple things you said in there. First of all, I wanted a character that was within this D.C. setting, so I had him working in this environment where he's working for this corrupt congressman. And that of itself presents a conflict usually between Joe and Mahoney, in terms of Mahoney's ethics are usually way beyond the pale. And yeah. Joe is kind of walking this narrow line of trying to stay sort of on the right path. Then you have the character Emma, who is more true blue than any of them, and so but the thing about Joe, and I'll tell you a little secret on this, Joe is basically me. I mean, in the sense of the way I see things, the way I would react to things normally, the cynicism I guess I sometimes have about politics and that sort of thing. That's basically the way I kind of think. Now, the situations I put Joe into, I wouldn't necessarily do those myself, but I've always sort of had a problem with the superhero character where, there's five. I remember. Well, I won't mention the author's name, but there's the protagonist is facing five bad guys, and this character's reaction is, well, I'll knock down three of them, the other two will run away.
Yeah.
A normal person would run away.
Right.
And so I've always sort of looked at, the way Joe reacts to things is kind of the way I would react if I was stuck in, a situation. I've just never felt real comfortable with the, with the superhero protagonist that's always, drags out his gun and shoots somebody. But the last thing about Joe, and I don't know if people realize, is when it comes to research, I do a lot of research. I'm kind of lazy. And so Joe basically knows no more than I know. So Joe doesn't have to be an expert on, neurosurgery or weapons or space programs or anything like that, because Joe knows what I know. And so that keeps me from having to pretend that he's an expert on something.
Oh, I love that angle. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, he isn't an but he's got good common sense and good instincts. I like that.
Well, that's one reason why Joe's a lawyer who's never practiced law. It's because I don't know the law. So, like I said, that allows me to, neither Joe or I are all that smart, and so this way I don't have to know that much as I write the books, other than the research that goes into the plotting.
Well, like you say, DeMarco, he's not a lawyer, or he is a lawyer, but he hasn't practiced law, and he's the son of a mob member with ties to the underworld. But like you say, he has integrity, and he works for the Speaker of the House, but he's in this really small, almost hidden, and what feels to me like a hideous office in the very lowest basement level of the Capitol building. And
by the way, that place actually exists. When I was researching the first book, this was pre 9/11, and back in those days, you could actually walk into the Capitol. And I'm writing the first book, and I said it's pre 9/11. I walked into the Capitol one day, and there was a little velvet rope barrier across some stairs. And I looked around; nobody was watching, so I just walked down the stairs. And I got down to the sub-basement level and walked around, and here was it was an emergency diesel generator room and a printer office of some kind and a maintenance room. And I said, here's Joe's office.
Oh, wow.
Perfect.
Now, today you can't do that, but...
Well, your description of it is perfect. It's really repelling in the book. So all these conflicting things about this hero, what is it about? Why does your writing compel me and your other readers to like a character that's so conflicted like that?
I think most readers sort of like flawed characters. I think. I mean, I think you can have either the good guy or the bad guy can almost be too good or too bad. It's like particularly the bad guy is some sort of a Terminator-like character that has nothing but this steely-eyed determination to kill. I don't like that kind of villain. I like a villain that's got some personality. Like in Elmer Leonard's books. The villains like cornflakes. They have a pet. They're not all pure evil. And same way with the good guys. Rarely is the good guy purely a good guy. He's going to be flawed in some way. And like in Joe's case, Joe's kind of lazy. He'd rather play golf than work. Which is kind of like me.
That's really very human.
Great. That's great.
Well, your sense of humor comes through for me in the books, especially the little asides that you include. And I just have to give an example here because I just love your sense of humor. So this one just made me laugh out loud, which the people around me on the bus think I'm crazy. But so, quote, in one of his optimistic, I know we can all work together moods, the president served a mixed group of Republicans and Democrats lukewarm water. a group that couldn't agree on what day of the week it was and chatted about a number of things, unquote. I just love that. Where do you come up? These are interspersed throughout your writing. Where do you come up with this sarcastic and at the same time delightful asides? And how much fun are they to come up with?
Well, for me, it's fun, but like I said, they just sort of come from my own perception of things sometimes. When I'm in a situation, I wouldn't necessarily say it out loud, but that's often what I'm thinking sometimes when I'm seeing a group of politicians interacting together, or put Joe in a certain situation. So it's just mostly my reaction to a circumstance, and I'm not really necessarily trying to be humorous. It's just a reaction. A lot of times I think it does come off as humorous, which I also like in the books. I mean, I like those little asides because it's fun. It's fun to write them, and it also, I think, have the plot isn't just constantly one action scene after another by putting those little asides in the book.
That's a good point.
Truly, it makes him human, I think, and more relatable.
Well, I hope so.
Absolutely. And I have a couple of questions for you, Mike. Could you tell us a little bit of the backstory on how the Rosarito Beach series came to be? Yeah, that was a strange one. I think, like all writers who write a series, well, now let me start at a different point. The Emma character in the DeMarco books appealed a lot to a certain a television producer. Now, I won't mention the guy by name, but he called me up one day and he said, "How would you like to work together on a thriller with a female protagonist?" And this producer, he produces for Lifetime, which in his own words is a chick flick channel. So he said, "Well, how'd you like to work on a thriller with a female protagonist? Maybe a movie for Lifetime." And so I thought about that, and I wrote a screenplay, which was basically Rosarito Beach. And I called the guy and I said, "Okay, well, here's my idea. You got this rogue DEA agent, and she gets involved in this thing down in Mexico and San Diego." And the guy says, "Oh, no, you don't understand. We film all our stuff in Ontario or Toronto or someplace to hold down costs." And I said, "Oh, well, I thought about that, and I thought about changing the screenplay." Then I said, "Nah, the heck with it. I kind of like what I had." And so at that point, it was very easy to turn it into a novel. And then I was surprised when Penguin actually wanted to make it a series, because I wasn't prepared to write the series. I hadn't, that's one of the problems with writing the series is if you're not really thinking ahead, you get yourself in trouble. Like with DeMarco, one of the books, I gave him a girlfriend. Well, I hated the girlfriend. So in the next book, I had to get rid of the girlfriend. Ah, okay.
Yeah, and so Rosarito Beach, I wasn't really prepared to write the series, and so, which got me into the second book where I moved Kay back into a D.C. environment where I was more comfortable, and then I'm having to figure out what to do with the daughter at that point, which was her role was primary in the first book, but I didn't really want her, in the way for the second book that much. And so, but anyway, so like I said, the background of that was kind of odd because it didn't come from from an idea I had to write a different kind of book. It really started with this discussion with this television producer.
Interesting. And then it just morphed into something else, something wonderful.
Yeah, it did.
Okay. Well, I know you've written two excellent series now. There's the Joe DeMarco series that Wendy's very enthralled with, and I am as well. And that's written under the name Mike Lawson, about the congressional fixer. And then there's the other series, the Kay Hamilton series, about this DEA agent, and those you write under the name M.A. Lawson. Can you give us some clues about what's next for you in terms of writing?
Well, there's a couple of things going on. One is there's another DeMarco book that I'm basically right now just waiting to hear back from the publishing company to see if we have a contract on that one. So there's another DeMarco book that's finished that I'm hoping will come out sometime this year. The second thing is I'm working on a standalone that has nothing to do with either series. It's just something I was intrigued by. And the third one, and I can't talk about this, so I'm not trying to sound coy about it, but I'm doing a collaboration with another writer, and I can't discuss the other writer, the topic at this point. So I'm juggling those three things right now: the collaboration, the the standalone, and then the DeMarco book, which is finished. So I'm just waiting to hear back from an editor on.
Great. Well, we'll stay tuned, and we'll hope you keep us updated via social media or however you want to update us.
Okay.
That sounds great. Another question for you, since I, in my past life, worked in college in a lot of research libraries, I'm always fascinated by research in general, and specifically the research needed to develop a book. And so my question to you, Mike, is how much research do you do on a new book? And do you do the research before, like Bob Dugoni does, or do you do it during the writing process?
I do it as I'm going along, to tell you the truth. I mean, I'm not... I research whatever I have to research to make the book as accurate as possible. Even though you're writing fiction, you want it to be accurate, because when it's not accurate, the reader will be reading something that he or she knows about, and if you have an error in there, it just is a big clang for the reader. It takes them out of the moment, because that thing in there that you got wrong is jarring.
Absolutely.
In my first book, to give you an example, I made a gun mistake in my very first book. You don't ever want to make a gun mistake.
No,
you get emails from every gun nut in the world will send you an email to tell you how that you made the gun mistake. And so, in all the books, I do the best I can, to get the facts correct. And whatever research that takes, whether it's it's online or you go to some place or you talk to an expert or whatever. And I'll also tell you, in almost every book, I made an error because there was something I thought I knew. I don't know why I thought I knew it, but I thought I knew it, and I was wrong. And so there's also that in there. But I do everything I can to try to make the books as accurate as possible when it comes to the facts or the places or whatever it is I'm talking about. And I do it as I'm going. I mean, I've usually, like I said, I'm working on the plot and the series, and the characters. But when I get to a place that says, so-and-so, drives 10 miles to Portland, well, then I'll stop and look up and see how long it takes to get to Portland.
Right. Okay. That makes perfect sense. And speaking of driving places and locations, it sounds like you actually visited a host of locations for your work on the Rosarito Beach books. I think you included settings like Camp Pendleton, a federal lockup facility, and some others. Can you explain for our listeners how difficult is it for a writer to gain access to these kinds of places?
Well, like in this case, specifically in the case of Rosarito Beach, in the way this actually worked, I wrote the book first, essentially, and I'm using online resources, and I'm using Google Maps, and I'm using Google Earth, and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
When I wrote the book, and then I went and made my wife and I, we took a trip down to San Diego, and it just so happened a friend of mine happens to be in the Army Reserve, and this guy happens to know a guy that was in the Navy that worked at Camp Pendleton. And so he put me in touch with the guy, and I said, well, can you get me on base just to kind of drive around? And I was actually surprised at how wide open Pendleton was. But, so I was able to get on the base. I drove out to the brig, looked at the area around there. As far as the federal lockup in San Diego, this is one of those cases where you got to be really careful about, using online resources. So that I had a scene in the book where basically the guy went around the block from the federal lockup to the federal courthouse. Well, in real life, you can't do that. There's actually a tunnel that goes between the two buildings. And so the first thing I had to do was get rid of the tunnel, which I did in the book through an earthquake, so it was under construction. And then I found out because of one-way streets, you couldn't really drive the way I said you could drive. And so I actually kind of wandered around for about an hour or so, figuring out the path this car was going to take. So I was looking, in that case, at the outside of the lockup in the courthouse. And so it's just a combination of you go down and you look at things, you contact a friend who has a friend that can get you on board the base and that sort of thing.
Right. And you hope you don't end up on somebody's federal watch list, right?
Well, I'll tell you, it's funny. When I was there at Pendleton, I was standing outside the brig, and I just kind of looking at it. I'm kind of making notes about, here's a guard tower, and here's where the fence is. And this sergeant comes out who looks like an honest-to-God Marine sergeant, and basically his question is, what the hell do you think you're doing here?
Right, yeah. Yeah, oops. But obviously he didn't lock you up, so.
No.
Okay, I have another question for you, and this is sort of my thing since I write thrillers and I read a lot of them as well. Many thrillers, especially political thrillers and military thrillers, tend to lack strong female protagonists and also lack strong female secondary characters, but not yours. So I'm thinking especially of Emma, whom you mentioned earlier, and she's the retired spy, and I put retired in quotes here, from the DeMarco series, especially in the book The Inside Ring. And for me, she was such a refreshing and enigmatic change from so many of the suspense and thriller novels where it seems female characters fall into three distinct archetypes. There's one that's the loyal wife or mother. There's another one that's the bimbo, the girlfriend, or the victim, sadly. And the last is kind of the elderly aunt, the ball-busting boss, the judge, or the wise crone, or the commanding officer. They seem to fall into only those three archetypes. And so I'm wondering, because Emma and certainly Kay are so three-dimensional, how did you develop these characters, and are they based on real people?
Well, I mean, first, they're not based on real people, but like in the case of Emma, and this is probably true of a lot of characters in fiction, that Emma, in a certain way, was a device. And what I mean by that is, Joe, with his job in Congress, he needed a way in some of the stories to get into organizations like the CIA or the NSA or the Pentagon or whatever. Right. Well, Emma was that device because of Emma's background, which I gave her intentionally. So here's a character in the book that can get Joe information from or into other aspects of the government where he normally wouldn't have access to. So that was one thing. The second thing about Emma is she was like a counterbalance to DeMarco. Like I said before, DeMarco can kind of walk kind of a wavery moral line. Well, Emma doesn't, and I've described her several times in the books as being, DeMarco's aggravating big sister, because she's the guy that'll be inclined to kind of slap Joe in the right direction when he needs to be slapped in the right direction. So she provides that sort of a moral push, if you will, for him to cause him to do the right thing, to make the right kind of decisions and that sort of thing. And I kind of like the fact that she's smarter than Jill. There's just
I did too. Yes,
I like that aspect of it. And so like I said, Emma came about as a DeMarco counterweight. She came about as a device. In the case of Kay Hamilton, I wanted a character again that was flawed. I mean, and Kay is clearly flawed. I mean, she doesn't play well with others. I mean, she can be arrogant and pushy. At the same time, she's incredibly brave and very inventive. But and like I told you, the background on that character, I actually just needed to start off the female protagonist. And again, I wanted one that was somewhat flawed. In fact, maybe she's too flawed. I don't know.
I don't know if that's possible. I think that gives them more dimension and more depth and really makes them compelling for a reader, certainly. Another question for you, do you have any workshops that you participate in terms of writers' conferences, or do you have any upcoming personal appearances or other writing-related news for us?
Well, as far as personal appearances, I'm doing a bunch of signings in the Seattle area in connection with the release of K Street. As far as conferences go, there's a couple I typically attend, not every year, but most years. One is the BoucherCon conference. I don't know if you've heard of that one or not, but BoucherCon's a mystery writer fan kind of convention that's held usually in about October or so.
Yes.
And it rotates from various cities. Another one is the Pacific Northwest Writers Association, which is held in Seattle. The thing that's good about these conferences for writers, and not just the fans, but for writers, is you meet people, you learn about things you don't necessarily know about on the business side of writing. I remember one conference I went to in Indiana. There was a guy there talking about taxes for writers. It was fascinating, and so I go to the conferences to meet fans, to meet other writers. You meet people that you can use later on for their expertise on things. And you make friends with just a lot of good people too. So, but those are a couple that I typically go to, or BoucherCon and the PNWA conference in Seattle.
Great. Well, I know PNWA is close to my heart and Wendy's as well, and we'll both be there this coming summer and perhaps maybe even presenting some workshops. So we will definitely look for you there.
Oh, well, good. Have a chance to meet you both in person. That's great.
Yeah, that'll be nice, won't it? And speaking of political mysteries, since we've been dealing with that for most of this podcast, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy now, who's going to tell us a little something about a president's daughter, a mystery series, and I think a book recommendation.
Well, in the spirit of Washington, D.C. being target rich, I'd like to talk a little bit about authors Margaret Truman and Donald Bain. Margaret Truman was the only child of President Harry Truman and Bess Truman. She authored several nonfiction books and an exciting series that came to be known as the Capital Crime Series. In the series, murders are happening all over Washington, D.C. Her first book in the series was Murder in the White House, published in 1980. And that was adapted to become the movie that you may have seen, Murder at 1600, starring Wesley Snipes. Just a few examples of the other murder sites in the series: Capitol Hill, Supreme Court, the FBI, the CIA, the Kennedy Center, the Watergate, and the Pentagon. The Capital Crimes mysteries don't have a single recurring character, although a few characters do appear in multiple books. And Donald Bain wrote the series with her. As he has said, they would meet several times for lunch and discuss scenarios for the next installment. Then he would draft it, and then they would huddle together over the drafts. Donald Bain said, "I knew she had kind of a jaded view of Washington, like her father, who had once said, quote, 'If you want to have a friend in Washington, get a dog.'" Bain remembered that when he first met Margaret, she told him, "I want the Speaker of the House killed." And then he said, "We just took it from there." So following Margaret's death in 2008, Bain signed on with the family to continue the series. And his name as the author appeared for the first time on the book that was published in 2012, Experiment in Murder. Published in August of 2015 was the 28th in the series, and that's called Internship in Murder. The most recent one, which was just published in June of last year, is called Deadly Medicine. According to Bain, one reason for the success of the Margaret Truman series is that it indulges in the reader's resentment of Washington, but from the view of an insider as the president's daughter. Readers can revel in how members of the Washington elite come to grief in a variety of ways and at many Washington landmarks.
That seems timely right now somehow.
Yeah.
Some things never change.
No.
I just want to note for my fellow cozy mystery fans, Donald Bain, among his prolific writings, also authors the Murder, She Wrote book series. He says that he's writing them in collaboration with TV's most famous mystery writer, Jessica Fletcher, but she only exists as a fictitious character, right? Sometimes I'm not sure. She seems so real.
She does.
The 45th novel in this series of Murder, She Wrote, he finished and published in August of last year. And that one takes Jessica to New York City and its famed Fashion Week, where the season's latest designs take a back seat to murder, which sounds très chic to me. So I'm going to give you a book recommendation to start with Murder in the Smithsonian by Margaret Truman. With all the people who visit the museum or who attend glittering Smithsonian events, the opportunity for intrigue tugs at the imagination. And why murder? Was it a robbery attempt of a priceless antiquity gone wrong? Or was the victim a target for some sinister reason? The author cleverly weaves in interesting history and little-known facts about the Smithsonian. As Margaret Truman herself said in an interview, "I love books. I really, really love them. There's something special about bringing people and books together." I agree. Mike, since you're an avid reader, I bet you have recommendations for our listeners.
Well, one thing I'll tell you, I met Donald Day, my wife, and I went out to dinner with him and his wife down in Long Beach at the last BoucherCon I attended. Wonderful guy, really
Wow.
nice guy. And I really enjoyed the time we spent, with them there. But anyway, marvelous man. I enjoyed talking to him.
Oh, that's so nice to hear.
As far as book recommendations, I tend to read quite a bit of nonfiction, and because those kind of blend in somewhat with kind of stuff I'm writing. But I really like Michael Lewis's books. The books he's written on the financial crisis and the Big Short and Moneyball and those books that he's written. I like Eric Larson's books, historical nonfiction. Like the last one about the Lusitania. On the fiction side, I tend to read a lot, but I like books like, for example, by Richard Price. I mean, I don't write anything like him at all, but I love his books and and the work he does on television with The Wire and The Night Of just recently. George Pelicano's stuff, which is set there in D.C. I like John Sanford's books a lot because I like the humor in the books and the way the characters come across as being very real. I think. Just to name a few, and I just read a lot of the mainstream writers that are out there, but I just lately I find myself just reading more nonfiction than fiction.
Great. And I have a book recommendation as well. Mine is by an author named Jacqueline Winspear, and that's spelled Winspear. It's part of a series of 12. The first of this brilliant series is named after the main protagonist, Maisie Dobbs. And you might think it's a cozy. It is not. The first book was an international bestseller, part of this brilliant series of 12 about sleuth Maisie Dobbs, who starts out, her backstory is she starts as a 13-year-old housemaid in an upper-class British household before the Great War, and then ultimately emerges as a brilliant and intuitive psychologist and sleuth. And really the whole series starts with her adult life after World War I in Britain, starting in about 1929. And she's a female investigator who's brilliant and battle-hardened from her service as a nurse during World War I, where she faced huge personal losses in the war and really saw a nation that was devastated by the after effects. So she's trained as an investigator by a brilliant mentor because of both her intelligence and her intuitive gifts. And the first book, I won't give away the plot, features Maisie where she solves a case involving PTSD. Yes, they had that even in World War I. And what happens to some disabled British veterans, and involves sort of her character transformation or her personal arc where she at the end faces down a ghost that's haunted her for a decade. I can't recommend this series highly enough. It's really wonderfully well written, well researched. And the other thing, which actually gets very little notice, is the book covers for the entire series. The artwork does an exceptional job of setting the tone for the time between the wars. Each cover looks like a travel poster from the 1930s, so there's something added there to enjoy as a reader. And I just think these are just wonderful, wonderful novels to start with if you're interested in that time period. And then I also wanted to talk just briefly about something that Wendy kind of jogged my memory on. She talked about being on the bus and being totally transported by fiction to the point where she wasn't even aware of the bus around her or the person that wanted the seat next to her. And so I thought I'd call this Why Our Brains Love a Story. And several of you know that I have recommended a book called Story Genius by Lisa Crone, and her previous book called Wired for Story as well in a past book review. But her writing on this topic and Wendy's notes on her bus ride commute really got me thinking about why we love stories, even from the earliest age where we're sitting on an adult's lap being read to. And it also made me think about which books are most memorable and most thought-provoking and why that is. So this applies, I think, whether you're a reader or a writer or both. And I wondered, what is it about some fiction that makes it impossible for you to put it down? What is it that makes a character or a story resolution linger in your mind forever? Well, Lisa Kron refers to story as the brain's decoder ring. In fact, she goes on to say that, like a mafia don, an effective story is an offer that your brain can't refuse. And she continues by giving evidence of biological reactions in our brain as the basis for this assertion. What she says is that we're really completely unaware of the power that story has over us, whether it's reading just one more page in that thriller when it's midnight and we have to get up at 6 a.m. to go to work, or getting sucked into the complete next episode of Homeland or Game of Thrones. In effect, like Wendy did on her bus ride, we tune out the real world and dive into an alternate reality. There's a lot of hype surrounding recent virtual reality hardware these days, but Lisa makes a case for story when she talks about this as the world's first virtual reality device. She frames it as a way for us, the reader, to step out of our present and as a safe method for us to envision the future, a way to plan for things that scare us most. It's a way to plan for dealing with the scary, the unknown, or the unexpected without risk of harm. It's a way for us to learn what we need in order to survive by living vicariously, walking in someone else's shoes. We are connected to the emotion in fiction, and that's a topic that I know Donald Moss speaks to often in his fiction workshops. But that emotion, that sense in truly successful fiction, whatever the genre, where the protagonist's internal struggle becomes our own. She goes on to point out that there are no cultures on Earth that do not have some form of storytelling. And it may seem like I'm digressing here, but stay with me. There are many opinions on what the world's oldest profession is. Yeah, even including that obvious answer. Doctors and nurses, if you ask them, will say healing. And if you talk to teachers and professors, of course, they're going to say teaching. But if you talk to those who've served in combat, they'll probably say making weapons or going to war as the first human endeavor. But I'd like to offer another option. Thousands of years ago, gathered around some distant fire under a star-filled sky, listening to the sounds of howling animals moving around in the brush, just out of sight, perhaps the world's oldest profession was that of storyteller, something that fulfills a very human universal need that goes far beyond mere entertainment. So again, if you get the chance to read the book Story Genius by Lisa Kron, highly recommended. And I think that's just about a wrap. Wendy, anything else from you or Mike?
Wow, that was really interesting, Julie. And Mike, this has just been wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike.
Oh, I had a great time. It was fun.
Good. We did too. And we're looking forward to reading more of your books, especially the new one that's coming out soon. And I think that's a wrap. And we'll take you out with more music, including The Man in the Panama Hat. Thanks again, and keep writing.